Thank you to you Seattleans, if that's what you call people from Seattle. Are you Seattleans? Seattleites, for coming out tonight on this beautiful night. I'm really impressed to see you here. It was so beautiful today. I was just stunned with the beauty of your city. I've never been here before, so I'm delighted to have this opportunity. There's a good chance that you've never been to where I come from, western Kansas, the very northwest corner, the Colorado-Kansas border region. So it's a very different landscape from what you're used to, I'm sure, for most of you. And I'm especially touched that you would come hear me, given that our landscapes are so drastically different. On the other hand, my story is about people, about relationships between a father and a daughter, myself and my son, me and a man that I met when I went back there to explore the watershed and managed to fall in love with so I could figure out a way to get back into right relationship with my family's land. But I didn't realize that's what I was doing at the time, of course. So anyway, it being about relationships, I think you'll find much that you can relate to in this story. I don't know if you got an opportunity to see any of the slides at the beginning. We had a few technical glitches, but I had a few slides that were, I think we managed to cycle them through a little bit, that showed you images of the Ogallala Aquifer. Those are slides by a gentleman named George Beggs, who lives in Boulder, Colorado, which is near where I now live. And I chose them because they very artfully render what is immense and yet almost impossible to see, because the aquifer is largely underground. It extends all the way from southern South Dakota to northern Texas, and the only time you see it is if you live there, grow up there, turn on the tap, or as in my mother's case, when she was growing up, take the tin ladle to the windmill and fill it, because that's the water coming directly out of the ground. Her father told her that if she filled that tin ladle, she should be sure to always drink it all, because water was precious. And she went on to tell me that story. I grew up in a semi-arid environment where water was indeed precious. The only other place that you might see it, and I got to find my clicker, here it is. Here were the images that we were cycling at the beginning, that sort of, all those blue dots are square miles where there are irrigation wells, and there are many irrigation wells usually in those square mile places. This is the other way that you might see the water. If you're a water nut like me, I tend to like to go out to landscapes and explore, looking for places where water comes to the surface of its own accord, which is the definition of a spring. I think it's a beautiful concept. It's as if the aquifer gives itself of its own accord, indeed, and it is a great gift, and I grew up being very appreciative of that. This particular river that I'm wading in is at one time it was a river. It was the Republican River, and it was much larger than this at one time. The reason that it's not flowing that strong now, actually, I'll tell you a little story at the end that might give you some hope in regard to the Republican. But at the time this image that was taken, it wasn't flowing very strongly because of irrigation. Because we have thousands of wells on the high plains, we're drawing the water down below the surface so that the natural streams and rivers can no longer flow. I'm going to begin now by reading from a section of the book from the very beginning. I wanted to give you an idea of what the book was like, so I'll read for about 15 minutes. Oh, I also wanted to mention, you know, when you hear people talk about where I come from, they often call it the heartland. The Ogallala Aquifer is actually the heart of the heartland. Think of it as it's pumping that blood into the land and making it live. And I chose this particular image because it looks a little bit like a heart. And this would be seen, the bottom would be, actually it's kind of flipped because the bottom would be the northern part of the aquifer. But I have always taken exception to that word, heartland. It seems a little bit saccharine to me, coming from my writerly sensibilities. But also, I take exception to it because it conflates two geographic regions. When I was in the 6th grade geography, I don't know what they told you, but when I was in 6th grade geography, there were the Great Plains, and then to the east of them were the states of Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, Michigan. That was the Midwest. I make the distinction because it's such a climatically and geographically different region. The Great Plains are arid and the sun shines almost perennially. The sky is very high. You don't have many trees, you don't have many hills, and you can see very far. I grew up feeling this magnificence of being. That's the phrase that one of the early explorers used to describe the feeling that the Great Plains put in the chest of a human being. And you get that because it is an arid climate that's wide open. So I think of it more as the spirit land as opposed to the heartland. This first section of the book is called A Rare Find. Falling in love is like reading a novel. It's an act of imagination, a suspension of disbelief. Mary Allen, Rooms of Heaven. These were called the high plains because they were 4,000 feet above sea level. I could feel the altitude and the way the sun sheeted my skin. It was like standing too close to a fire with no means of escaping unless I dashed back to the car and switched on the air conditioner. Instead, I trudged through wheat stubble that used to be the south end of our pasture, my shoes filling with powdery dirt and my socks with stickers. This western Kansas land had belonged to the Carlsons, my mother's side of the family. When I was 16, my parents traded their share in it for land elsewhere in the county. Like many other successful farmers, they built a new house in town. More than 3 decades had passed since then. Although I knew there wouldn't be water in the creek here, I wanted to walk down its dry bed as I had in childhood, picking up every shiny piece of agate I saw, hoping to discover an arrowhead. In the dry places, men begin to dream, wrote Wright Morris, who grew up north of here in Nebraska. Where rivers run sand, something in man begins to flow. I thought I knew exactly what he meant. The sandy beds of dry creeks unfurl evocatively into the beckoning distance, inscribing their faint script over the land. They entice the exploring spirit. But when I arrived at the Little Beaver, I discovered that the creek was now nothing more than a depression. Runoff from all the newly farmed pasture land had filled it with silt. Weeds grew where there had once been smooth sand, vacant and pinkish tan. In my childhood, the sand had poured sensuously through my hands, each granule having its own color, shape, size, sheen. Our sense of beauty is a survival instinct, telling us that a place can sustain us for generations to come. I'd always known this in my bones, but it wasn't until many years after I left Kansas and discovered my passion for wilderness that the intuition became conscious. This creek was now ugly. That didn't bode well for the underlying aquifer's ability to support life in the future. Rain and snow melt couldn't filter into the ground as efficiently through dirt as they could through sand. And sandy creek bottoms were critical to the meager half-inch of recharge that the aquifer received each year. It needed all it could get because irrigation farmers were allowed to pump 40 times that amount. At least the north end of the pasture remained in grass. Standing here as a child, I often pretended that this was the original Kansas, pre-us. The low-growing grass stitched itself over the ground like a woolly tapestry, accented, especially in the spring, by other pastels, blue gramagrass, apricot mallow, the yellow and cream waxen blooms of cactus and yucca. Prairie dogs chirped alarms from mounds of whitish clay, and meadowlarks sang from their perches on yucca spires, their notes climbing and dipping like winding ribbons. Instead of cows, I imagined buffalo grazing the hills. The grass had been named after the buffalo because millions of them once thrived on it. We'd called this our canyon pasture because the creek had carved some cliffs into the otherwise smooth terrain. The canyon was really no more than an interruption in the earth, as my mother called it, but it was the wildest topography in this part of the county. The one-room school that she'd attended and that my brothers and I also went to before the farm schools were closed and we started riding the bus to town used to hold field trips here. The boys would try to throw rocks across the canyon, and in its shadowy ruts and ravines, we caught orange-speckled lizards as they dashed beneath the bayonet-shaped leaves of yucca. I remembered my brother Clark's hand on my arm, cautioning me to look closely before grabbing. Once we heard a buzzing sound and jumped back from the bush I'd been about to reach beneath. A tongue-flicking, tail-rattling snake lay coiled at our feet. Its vibrant, diamond-shaped head bobbed in the air, mouth open, fangs bared. "Why is it wiggling its tongue at us?" I asked. "That's how it smells you," said Bruce. Also my elder, but closer to my age than Clark, he loved nothing more than goading me. "It can't strike this far, though," Clark said. "We're safe." The little beaver made a horseshoe turn here. Our old windmill stood on the spit of land formed by the bend. When I paid visits to the canyon as a child, my father's ewes and their lambs would be drinking out of the low troughs. They would scatter as I approached, their hooves sounding like water riffling over rock. But today, only a few cattle grazed the hill above the canyon, moving in and out of the shadows of cumulus clouds. I used to climb the windmill and sit up there for what seemed like hours, transfixed by the shadows. They might have been cast by lily pads or boats on the bottom of a lake. From that height, I could also see our big house's red roof rising above a shelter belt of elms. But if I climbed the windmill's narrow ladder today, I knew too well that I would not see our roof or even the trees. My grandfather Carlson had built the house high on a knoll. With stately trees and a huge red barn beside it, it had been a landmark, visible for miles around. Now it was as if all evidence of our existence had been erased by the wand-like arm of the center pivot irrigation sprinkler I'd parked beside. Like all the sprinklers that circled these plains, this one was made from a quarter-mile of pipe strung between steel towers. Along the pipe's length, hoses hung down with spigots on the ends, spraying a uniform mist over a 130-acre circle of 6-foot-tall, fully tasseled corn. I could hear the pump engines growl, pulsating on the morning's mounting heat. It hadn't been like this in the mid-'60s when we left this place. It had been quiet then. But now, in this second year of the new millennium, you couldn't escape that sound on the high plains. Our current farm, only about 10 miles from here as the crow flew, was no exception. We had 5 irrigation wells, some of which ran all day and all night during the growing season. We drew the water from the most plentiful source of groundwater in the country. The Ogallala Aquifer was the hope and promise at the center of the nation, the source of life that had made habitation possible for millions of years before the words United States, or any words, for that matter, had been coined. On geologists' maps, it was roughly the shape of a tornado, wide at the top where it lay under parts of South Dakota, Wyoming, and Nebraska, and narrowing to a funnel in Texas where farmers had been irrigating longest. The maps indicated depletion rates in colors ranging from blue, in much of Nebraska where water was still plentiful, to brown and almost black in some parts of Kansas and North Texas, meaning gone, pumped dry, or at least to below usable levels. Those dark freckles of high decline were spreading like cancers, gradually enlarging and taking over hundreds of square miles. The windmills fan whirred and the well rods creaked up and down, making a tinny, lonely sound. Water spurted from the pipe into a tank. These, not the growl of irrigation engines, were the sounds I equated with water while growing up. The rhythm was systolic, soothing. I washed my arms and face in the transparent rope, which fattened and thinned as the windmill breathed. I drank. The best water in the world, Mom used to say. She was right. Going down my throat, it felt as cold and bright as the sunlight was hot and bright. After leaving the farmstead, I take the road northeast toward the Little Beaver's outlet in the Republican River, which is a distance of about maybe 40 miles. Along the way, stopping every time the road crossed the creek, and I would get out and walk along the creek bed, and I was looking for a spring. I wanted to find one of those places that I showed you an image of earlier, of me wading in the water. I hadn't as yet found any springs in the Little Beaver. I'd never looked for them before. I had only recently become aware that there were any. I had been reading about the Native Americans and the people who had been camping along the creeks in that region all the way back to the Pleistocene. For over 10,000 years, this water had supported human life. So there would be sun dances with the tribe that most immediately preceded us on the plains. The Cheyenne would hold sun dances. There'd be maybe 4,000 Indians, maybe 15, 20,000 horses, all drinking out of these springs. And I knew that whatever I did find or didn't find that day would be commentary on the price that the land had paid for my family's comfort. So I had a lot invested in finding a spring. I did, in fact, find a little spring. It was really exciting for me to behold. It was not much. It was just some water in the creek bed. There were some cows nearby. I was pretty excited to see the water nonetheless because to me, it warranted school field trips. I mean, it was that important. Here was something that really was of that level of importance. But it was hot out, and there was a cottonwood tree on the bank, and so I crawled out of the creek bed and was sitting in the shade of a cottonwood tree when I heard this familiar clanging noise. It was the sound of a pickup coming down the hill pulling an empty stock trailer. I was a little bit embarrassed to be out there in the middle of this person's pasture, but it was a little too late for me to do anything about it. So I stood up, and I'm going to begin here again and just read a few more pages. My sudden appearance spooked the blue heeler who rode on the pickup's flat bed. He barked frantically until the truck drew to a stop beside me and his owner shouted, "Can it, Spider?" "Hello," I said. The dog was keeping me pinned in the gaze of one blue and one brown eye. His lip edged up over canines as he emitted a low growl. "I don't mean to trespass," I said. "I was just looking for springs." The man got out of his pickup. A half-foot taller than I, broad-shouldered and large-boned, he had the dry, dusty look I expected in plainsmen, his skin sun-darkened, his blond mustache sun-streaked. He pointed toward the creek. "I guess you found this one." "Yes, it's so hot out, though. The shade looked inviting." He extended a hand. "Ward Albright. Julene Bair. I grew up not far from here." It surprised me that he didn't seem to recognize my surname. There weren't many people in those two counties, Cheyenne and Sherman, who hadn't heard of my father, Harold Bair. He'd been well known for his large herd of sheep. This was mainly cattle country. Ward clasped my hand hard enough to register respect anyway, maybe for my freedom to wander wherever I chose. "Don't worry," he said. "I don't think Conway would care. I came up to collect these horses I loaned his daughter." He raised his chin toward the hill above us where two bays, a mare and a half-yearling, grazed. "For a 4-H project." "This is the first time I ever saw a spring in the Little Beaver. Can you believe that?" He nodded. "There are plenty of them, but when you're a kid, you don't know anything other than what's out your back door." "Used to be plenty of them," I said. "I've read that more than 700 miles of Kansas creeks and rivers no longer flow. Is that a fact? It's a shame what we're doing to the water." He looked perplexed. Oh boy, I thought. Was I about to have a political argument with one of those fanatics who thinks that owning land gives him the right to abuse whatever was on or under it? Then I reminded myself that here in Kansas, it was I who would be considered the fanatic. I probably sounded like one now. Ward said, "Hey, didn't you write that book? I recognize you from the picture on the back of it." This was surprising, to say the least. Besides my mother, the only locals I knew who'd read my essay collection had been one fourth grade and one high school English teacher. "I liked that book so much," Ward said, pausing to reminisce. "It had this melancholy quality about it that reminded me of the Last Picture Show. Larry McMurtry, I'm sure you know his work." Not as well as I should. In fact, I hadn't gotten around to McMurtry. "I even considered writing to you. I figured your publisher would forward the letter." "You wanted to write to me?" I asked. "Why didn't you?" "Oh, sure now. You would have thought I was some kind of nutcase." "No, I would have been flattered." I looked up into the shadow his hat cast. For the first time, I noticed his eyes, an arresting Caribbean sea green. I lowered my gaze. Dark circles stained the underarms of his T-shirt, a light gray color that a man would grab on a routine morning when he didn't expect anything new to happen. And nothing new was going to happen. After all, this guy wore a silver belt buckle. Burnished by years of wear, it featured your standard calf roper. Jake's dad had cured me of my cowboy fascination. That's what you missed in the part I cut. I have a 16-year-old son at home. I could imagine how I looked. After dousing my head at the windmill, I'd just jammed my cap back on. It had the word Vita-Vu embroidered on it below a silhouette of that granite mountain range, one of my favorite haunts near Laramie, Wyoming, the town where I lived. Ward's cap also bore a Wyoming emblem. King Ropes, a famous saddler. "Do you read much?" I asked. "Winters get long when you live in the country, and I always liked a good book." Taking a blue kerchief from his hip pocket, he removed his hat, revealing a high forehead. No ring, I couldn't help but notice as he wiped his brow. But ranch and farm types didn't always wear rings. Dad hadn't. "Could use a little of that winter weather now," Ward said. "My favorite author is Cormac McCarthy." Were we really standing in a Kansas pasture? Louis L'Amour I might have expected, or Zane Grey. "I like the way he drops into Spanish," I said. "Soy yo que traigo las yeguas de las montañas." "You memorized that," Ward said. "What does it mean?" "'Tis I who brings the mares from the mountains," I declaimed. When I taught at the University of Wyoming several years ago, I always assigned all the pretty horses, even though I think McCarthy was intentionally over-romantic in that book. He was playing with the cowboy myth. "I don't know about that," Ward said. His tone made me wonder if he'd ever heard the two words myth and cowboy together before. "I'll admit McCarthy did get some of the details wrong," he continued. "Did you notice that whenever those two boys went into a saloon, they would take their cigarettes out of their shirt pockets and put them on the bar top? Now, a cowboy just wouldn't do that." "What would a cowboy do?" "He'd leave them in his pocket, take them out when he wanted one, then put them back." This had to be the most ridiculous cowboy rule I'd ever heard, and I'd heard a lot of them. I glanced at Ward's rough-out leather boots and his jeans, bunched at the ankle. Jake's dad used to stand before the mirror, making sure his pant legs bunched exactly like that. He'd explained that a cowboy wore his pants long so they wouldn't appear too short when he straddled a horse. He had a whole list. Cowboys didn't wear sunglasses or feathers on their hats. They wouldn't wear a buckle like Ward's unless they'd won it. They wouldn't be caught dead in shorts. They called women ladies. And to him, he said, that's what I would always be. I'd learned the hard way how false such chivalry was. Okay. Well, despite that little hesitation on my part, Ward and I did develop a relationship. We shared some common interests in the watershed and in the history of the Native Americans and so on, and he wrote a good letter. And so I wound up seeing him, and so much of the rest of the book continues the story of that relationship while also telling the story of my family and our land. I thought you would like to see some of the images of some of the things I was just talking about. There's a little, not much, but to me very exciting spring in the bed of the little beaver. It's actually, this one was not in the bed of the little beaver, but it's very much like the spring I found that day. This is what the windmill sounds like. This is what I imagined when I stood in the pasture valley and imagined the grass going on forever, as it had before we came and plowed it up. This is the canyon. About 2 weeks ago, I was coming back from a little tour of eastern Kansas and eastern Nebraska, and I stopped at the old farmstead and went back out to the canyon again. This is my mother when she was about 19 or 20 years old, standing on that same knoll. This is a different angle, but if you look at the top right, that's the rock that she's standing on up there. This is the house that my grandfather built. There was always a windmill in the background of any farmhouse. This was the barn in my grandfather's time. This is my mother in the farmyard that she and her mother had turned into a veritable oasis with Ogallala water. This is my brothers and me, the older one on the left and the one who liked to goad me, my brother Bruce, on the right. When this book opens, my older brother has already died. He's been dead for perhaps 12 years. So it's up to my brother Bruce and I to see if we can live up to my father's expectations and do what he always commanded us to do, which is, hold on to our land. This is going to be a little bit problematic because my environmental ethics are conflicted with the profit motive. The two of them are deeply in conflict within me. This is my father. As he graduated from Colorado State University, he was the only one of 6 siblings to go to school, to go to college, but he never wanted to do anything but farm. He really had farming in his blood. So he studied agronomy. And while in college, he learned about sheep, which he realized he could make a lot more money on than cattle. And that's why he became what he called a sheep herder. And there's some of his sheep. It was a very animaled and peopled life, a very physical and very sensory existence. There were always many different kinds of farm animals, not just sheep, the cows, chickens, ducks, pigs, you name it. There were dogs and cats and all sorts of pets, wild pets, jackrabbits, cottontail rabbits, snakes, hawks, burrowing owls, you name it. I mean, anything out there, my brothers and I would capture and tame it. We were very integrated and interwoven with that climate and that soil. My dad was a very expert dryland wheat farmer. This was him probably when he was about 75 or so, standing in a field of wheat. In order to be a dryland farmer, you need to practice the art and science of nurturing every last drop of moisture in your soil. That's what's entailed in that. To be a dryland farmer is to farm where rainfall is deficient. Rainfall in our area was about 17 inches, but it kind of depends on what you view as deficient. I mean, we made it work, so I guess it wasn't really deficient. We were prosperous farmers, and so were most of our neighbors. And it certainly looked like we intended to stay there. I mean, why would we build a house that big if we didn't intend to stay there? There were 5 or 6 other outbuildings as well. Then to see the house replaced by this. And that's what predominates now on the high plains. And to see the water that I grew up thinking of as precious now being mined into extinction. This map of the Ogallala Aquifer gives you an idea of the areas that are most intensely in danger. It's different colors from the description I read in my book. We have different maps at different times. But it just shows you the number of feet of decline in certain areas. And now when you look out of a plane window, and this is actually a Landsat photo, you see the land all carved up into circles and squares. And those kind of gray-green areas that you see occasionally, those are the original buffalo grass pastures. But there are just so few of them left. So it was very difficult for me to see that happen. E.B. White, who was a famous essayist and someone many of you might know as the author of Charlotte's Web, once wrote that when he gets up in the morning, he's often torn between whether to save or savor the world. That's a tension that I have felt very intensely, and I think many people in this audience have probably felt it as well. But I actually think it's a false dichotomy, because if you have a genuine relationship with anything, you're not going to have to decide whether to save or savor it. You're going to try to do both. Think about, since it's Mother's Day, think about if your mother is ill and in the hospital, are you going to choose one or the other? Are you going to try to make every last minute with her count because it might be your last, or are you going to try to save her, or are you going to try to do both? Of course we're going to try to do both. I think the problem the problem that we have is that we don't understand that we do have a relationship with nature that is just as vital as our relationship with our loved ones. For me, my life journey has been a journey to discovery of how deep that connection to the land I was born on truly is, how it formed every aesthetic, how it gave me a living, how it nourished me, it fed me, I drank its water. And consequently, it really made us who we were. We were those dryland farmers. That was a way of life. It wasn't just a lifestyle. It gave us our character, everything about us. So it's a natural outgrowth of that to want to try to write about it and to try to do what I can to save it. The 1960s was when we first developed irrigation in our area. At that time, that was just when the irrigation was kind of moving north from Texas. The technology was coming to us at that point in time. And the farmers, like my father, heard the call of those prophets and obeyed. They heard the call of all that water. It meant they could get 3 times the yields of what they were getting before, and they could now grow crops that they couldn't grow successfully there before. Sugar beets was one of the first crops in our area, and that was a very profitable crop. But corn was also a very profitable crop, and that's primarily what's grown there today, corn and soybeans. I ran across this beautiful depiction of the Ogallala siren on the internet and became friends with this artist. Because I just think this is so beautiful. The water is beautiful. The woman that the water metamorphoses into is beautiful. It's a great treasure, and we boil it all down to hamburgers. It's really profane what we're doing with that water, especially when you think about what those hamburgers do to us. I mean, this is feedlot beef. All that grain we grow goes to fatten cattle, who in turn fatten us, give us diabetes, heart disease, cancer. So there are better ways to feed the world than to process our grain through livestock. But when my father was beginning on that Ogallala aquifer mining track, I was beginning on yet another track. I was about 16 years old when we started irrigating. We had moved to town. And to tell you the truth, I don't even think I know. I don't even think I knew whether we irrigated or not. I think if someone asked me, I was so oblivious at that point to what was going on the farm. I was so really, separate from it at this point because we had moved to town and because I was a teenage girl that I wouldn't have known if you'd asked me. And I began my own elliptical journey, both metaphoric and literal, away from Kansas and back again. I left when I was about 18. It was 1967. I headed for San Francisco. I spent about 8 years there in a marriage that was not right for me. And at the end of that marriage, I started going camping in the wilderness, and I rediscovered the outdoor world and fell in love with it. I especially fell in love with water. I think that dry land past of mine made me just yearn for water in a way. And when I saw these beautiful, blue, deep, lucid mountain lakes, I would just dive into them. And there was nothing more exhilarating for me than to dive into a mountain lake. But I also fell in love with the Mojave Desert. And I think that's because it's as I write in the book. Water is the desert's most profound expression of itself, the antithesis without which desert could not exist, the joy that makes its barren beauty habitable. So my dry land spirit was awaking in me, and I got so zealous about the desert that I actually moved there to a little house, a cabin in the middle of the mountainous wilderness in the Mojave. I thought I was going to be this modern-day Thoreau. I thought that maybe within a year or two I'd be publishing in the New Yorker and I'd be a successful writer. So I set off all my stories and got rejection slips enough to paper my outhouse. This is how I spent my free time in the Mojave. There was a water tank down the road a couple of miles, and I would go swimming every summer afternoon. It was just exhilarating. It was so wonderful. It was cold. It just come out of the ground there, and you can see the windmill tower beside it. And I was really feeling my oats in the Mojave. I was in my element, really enjoying the outdoors, feeling very independent. Learning how to do things that I had grown up thinking only men could do, like fixing my own truck when it broke and building my own outhouse with a hammer saw and nails and shovel. I had no electricity, so I had to resort to that means of doing everything. There was only one problem, and that was I was alone out there, and I was really lonely. and so I made what I look upon now as another unfortunate choice in husbands. And as a result, I wound up back home, broken pregnant. This is my father on the left, and this is me, and I'm chosen the overalls because, overalls, right, because only they would fit around my belly. And these are commercial sunflowers we're standing in that we're growing, and that pipe, that's an irrigation pipe along the base, and that's how we were irrigating then. It was called flood irrigating, and I'm going to read just one more section about that. When I wasn't training a John Deere's chrome arrow on some fence post or distant patch of weeds, I was one of my father's flood men. He would eventually convert to center pivot sprinklers, but when I lived there, we were still irrigating mostly out of huge pipes laid along the tops of the fields. Each summer morning and evening, I would belt Jake into his car seat in the blue Chevy pickup Dad had bought me for both farm and personal use and drive out to the corn. As I knocked the floodgates open, the water would gush out in beautiful arcs, and with such force that if I tried to slice my hand through it, my arm would be thrown back, almost dislocating my shoulder. To direct the water into the furrows, I placed socks tubes of woven plastic mounted on wire hoops over gates in the pipe. Having lived in the Mojave, I quickly adjusted to working in hot sun, and the work led to sensuous exhaustion at each day's end. In Main Street, I wrote in my journal, Sinclair Lewis calls the look of the land at sunset fulfilled. True of the land's creatures, too. Work and my past here makes me one of these. But life in the desert had also sensitized me to the value of water. Because the rock house had no well, I had borrowed a tank from my neighbor. Whenever the tank ran out, I would hook the cruiser up to the flatbed trailer it rested on, drive the 2 miles to his house, and refill from his carefully conserved windmill supply. I have since learned that Americans, on average, use between 80 and 100 gallons of water each day. I made that 500-gallon tank last for more than a month. Imbued with the respect water demands where it is not readily accessible, I greeted the appearance of so much of it coming out of the ground in our desert-like heat as surreal. Why didn't all High Plains farmers, who had surely grown up conserving water just as my mother had, her father making her drink all she poured into the tin cup that hung on their windmill, not mistrust such bounty? I had not yet seen any of the maps that would later trouble me, no brown blots where the aquifer had been exhausted. All I had to go on was a gut feeling. I knew we couldn't draw that much water from the ground and expect it to keep flowing forever. What would we do when we ran out? What would the next several thousand years of High Plains inhabitants do for water? As I lay in my bed at night, the backs of my lids strobing with images of all the rows of corn I'd driven past that day and of silver water snaking down each furrow, the incessant growl of the pumps plagued my conscience. The big truck engines, converted to run on natural gas and mounted on concrete pads at the edges of the fields, seldom stopped, even at night. The water didn't belong to the farmers, although most of them seemed to think it did. The state allowed us to use it, but only up to the limits of the rights granted to us. Many farmers, however, didn't even bother to fill out forms reporting how much water they used. Dad was apparently among them. One day over dinner, he fished a letter out of his lunchbox and handed it to me. It was from the Kansas Water Office, informing him that from now on, farmers would be fined for not reporting. We didn't know how much water we'd pumped that year. The water office hadn't made us install meters yet, so the only way to figure it out was by using the bills that the utility company sent for each engine. Dividing the total gas usage by an estimate of how much the engines used in 1 hour, we could estimate the number of hours we'd pumped, then multiply by the engine's pumping rates. Dad said he'd tried to do all this himself, but he couldn't get his old noggin to do the numbers. I can still see the utility bills scattered over my kitchen table. I remember how confusing it was to discover that 2 of the wells shared a gas meter. But mostly I remember my shock when I totaled the numbers. We'd pumped 139 million gallons that season. Even though we irrigated more than 700 acres at the time, half of that amount went onto our 80-acre cornfield. That was more than 4,000 gallons of water for every bushel of corn we'd harvested. Hoping to prove that irrigated corn wasn't really profitable, I suggested I do a spreadsheet computing the cost of labor, fuel, depreciation, chemicals, seed, property taxes, everything. Go ahead, Dad said. Compute your heart out. The conclusion I reached, we barely broke even on corn until I factored in the subsidy checks, which put us $10,000 in the black. Are you satisfied? Dad asked. No, they're paying us to throw away water, and it's so irrational. The only reason people out here grow corn is because of the subsidies, but there's a corn surplus. The more we grow, the lower the price, so the more subsidies they have to give us. It's a vicious circle. That might be true, he allowed, but if the government paid Midwestern corn farmers to the east of us to grow corn, it wouldn't be fair to draw a line down the middle of the country and separate our poor, dry, old plains asses from those lucky so-and-sos who get rain. I sighed. "Don't despair," Dad said. "Big Daddy will put the plug in before it's too late." By Big Daddy, he meant the government. He had faith in this. It was the government's job to look out for the general good, preventing any serious harm individuals might cause in the pursuit of private gain. In his lifetime, he'd seen the feds bust trusts, protect unions, and protect the environment with clean air and water laws. The farm program dictated many of his practices. In return for his subsidy checks, he had to leave a certain amount of organic matter on the surface. He'd been required to terrace his hillier land. The Soil Conservation Service, set up in FDR's presidency, enforced these measures to prevent our topsoil from abandoning itself to water erosion, or the wind from picking it up and dropping it on Oklahoma, as it had done during the Dust Bowl. Big Daddy always had his hand in, and he would certainly reach in and do something before the water was all gone. In the meantime, my daddy would raise his brows, cock his head at me, and smile with overstated cheer. Until then, I got mine. So, yeah. Today, it's not just government subsidies that are underwriting corn, it's the renewable fuel standard. We now are required, the nation's refineries are now required to mix more and more ethanol with the gasoline each year. As a result, since this ethanol mandate kicked in 2008, corn prices have tripled, causing, as you can imagine, more and more corn acres to be planted and more drawdown of the aquifer. And it's not just the aquifer region that is being harmed by the ethanol mandate. 23.6 million acres of marginal lands that should never be plowed to begin with, grasslands, wetlands, marshes, and so on, have been put into production because of the ethanol mandate. Some of that land is Conservation Reserve Program land. This was on our farm. We still have this land. There's this in the foreground, that's buffalo grass, which is coming back because, it's the native and it's what's going to wind up predominating. But when that land is taken out of production, it looks like this. So you can imagine that's not very good for the soil at all. So I guess I have a pretty, I should tell you what my solution is, right? I mean, okay, instead of just complain, I should tell you what we need to do. We need to end the ethanol mandate. Most people know and will agree with you today that it is not the boon we thought it would be for the environment. It takes almost as much fossil fuel to make a gallon of ethanol as we save by using ethanol. There are many other side harms from ethanol because of the use of herbicides and so on. We should also, instead of subsidizing crops that are not intended for that region, we should do what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is telling us and preserve that aquifer so that we can use it to supplement the dryland crops which used to grow there quite well but are not likely to continue growing quite well because of increased drought and increased temperatures. So we might need to use 1 or 2 inches to supplement a wheat crop, for instance, as opposed to the 14 to 20 inches that are needed in the region right now to grow corn. And the government should, instead of subsidizing the corn, should be subsidizing farmers' return to dryland crops and to retiring their water rights in some cases. And there is a precedent for that. Another thing that can be done is we can go back to grazing. These were my father's cows in 1993, the year before he died, on another pasture. And it's what that land was originally intended for and was doing quite marvelously before we came along. So I think I've pretty much told you why I'm on the Ogallala Road. And there's a video of me swimming in the Republican River, which is running high now. Okay. Because, why is it running high? Because we've closed down many irrigation wells because Kansas sued Colorado. And as a consequence, Colorado agreed to close down some wells. And voila, the river's running again. So, okay. Is it time for question and answers? Yeah. Okay.
I read I think it was Mark Reisner who wrote Cadillac Desert some years ago, which was the first book that alerted me to the water problem that we will be facing in the near future. And I wondered if there's any contemporary work that is more or less along those lines, the most well-informed thing that you know in the popular science journalism field that talks about these issues.
I know there's books, and for some reason it's escaping me right now, one book I'd like to recommend, but let me recommend Circle of Blue online. It's the best source of water news out there. They're just so up to date, worldwide. Anything you want to know about what's happening, you can search that source and find out anything you want to know about any region where there are water problems.
Circle of Blue. Circle
of Blue online, yeah.
And my second question is, you talked about retiring water rights. Would you speak more to that?
Yeah, we're already doing it. It's called the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, CREP, from the federal government. We're just not doing it extensively. There's just not much of a budget for it. But in those areas where aquifers are in danger, there is some federal money to pay farmers to retire their water rights. And they're paid handsomely enough that they agree to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
In the northern part of the aquifer, have there been any problems with the chemicals from fracking?
There's a lot of fracking going on in the aquifer region. I don't know any particular stories about leaks and so on. Where I live, along the Front Range of Colorado, the county just to the east of us, Weld, has thousands and thousands of wells, and there's been many incidents of spills and so on. And so I'm sure it's happening in the aquifer region. Where it's going to be most dangerous when it happens is where the soil is the sandiest, I think, if it's a surface spill. And that's where the Keystone Pipeline issue comes into play here too as well. The reason that Keystone is dangerous to the aquifer in that region is because the soil is sandy there, and so the chemicals would penetrate the aquifer more quickly. But it's incorrect to think that just because the chemicals get into the aquifer there, it's going to pollute the whole aquifer, because the aquifer is a geologic formation. It's saturated sands, gravels, rock, and so on. It's like a giant sponge, and the lateral travel is incredibly slow in the aquifer, and also there's a downhill slope going west to east. But if there's a spill in the Keystone, in the region of the eastern sandhills, that will infiltrate the streams and rivers in that area, and it'll be a terrible thing for the aquifer in that region. And really, I wrote a editorial for the New York Times about non-point source pollution of the aquifer, which is what industrial agriculture is doing everywhere we farm above the aquifer. And the levels of herbicides, especially atrazine, which is an herbicide that's widely used on corn, they are going up all the time, and they're already above safe levels in many wells. I think it's in 5% of the wells, but you should check my article because I get my numbers mixed up. The nitrates are also penetrating the aquifer, and that might be 14%. I can't remember. It's 14 and 5 or 5 and 14. But anyway, it's what the U.S. Geological Survey calls creeping normalcy, meaning it just creeps up the charts. The contamination just creeps up the charts over time.
I was wondering what kind of a reception you've gotten in the Ogallala area, Kansas, Nebraska.
So far, I've only gone to eastern Kansas and Nebraska, which is a little safer. I'm waiting to go to western Kansas. I hope to get an interview soon on High Plains Public Radio. I think that would be a good way to begin, because that station is in Garden City, Kansas, which is right at the heart of the most intense corn country in the state. There's a lot of feedlots there and packing plants and so on. And they, in that area, that groundwater management district in that area is so in such despair over the fact the aquifer is going down that they are really pushing this plan to build a canal from eastern Kansas, which is a distance of 400 miles, and pump Missouri River water 4,000 feet uphill to their county. And they're beginning to take it seriously in Kansas as a viable option, rather than just stop doing, farming a crop that should not be grown there in the first place.
You mentioned that Kansas successfully sued Colorado to get wells capped. Could you describe a little more the basis for that suit?
Yes. Yeah, I was a little rushed there. What happened, Kansas actually sued Nebraska and Colorado because the river runs through all three states, and the flow in Kansas was too low was going down, and irrigators, the ones who irrigated out of the river itself, were not able to access the water that they had historically accessed. So this went on for something like 15 years. It was a U.S. Supreme Court case. Finally, Colorado decided to settle its part of the suit. They not only closed down hundreds of irrigation wells, I'm told, by the people in that water district who run that water district, but they also opened the floodgates at Bonnie Dam, which is a reservoir on the Colorado side of the border. But that's all Ogallala water. The Republican River is completely spring-fed river. So between those two solutions, the river is now running high and strong and blue and beautiful, and that's why I was so excited that I took an October swim in it. It was just too much to resist, because that's the same river that I was wading in that slide at the beginning, which was just a little trickle at that point. So there is hope, but the clock is really ticking.